He tore off his cassock live during Mass and said, "God forgive me, but I choose power." Father Ricardo Mendes shocked 800 faithful that Sunday when he announced he would trade the altar for a seat in Congress. The Vatican had already sent the ultimatum: politics or priesthood. He chose the platform. What came after was a silent war. Anonymous letters, threats, divided families, and a community destroyed by rage. While Ricardo climbed onto platforms with inflammatory speeches, Rome prepared the final blow: definitive expulsion. This is the true story of how a man of faith lost his soul by trading the gospel for votes. My name is Ricardo Mendes, and I used to be a priest. Today, when I look back, I still feel the weight of the cassock I carried for 17 years, and the emptiness it left when I decided to tear it off myself. This is my story, the story of how I chose power instead of God, and how that choice destroyed not only my life, but that of hundreds of people who trusted me. I was born in Santa Clara do Vale, a small town in the interior of Minas Gerais. One of those places where everyone knows each other by name and secrets last less than fresh bread at the bakery. My mother, Donna Teresa, was a woman of unshakable faith. She woke up at 5 in the morning every day to pray the rosary before going to work in the fields. My father, Su Antonio, was a quiet, hard-working man who only opened his mouth to pray the Our Father at the table or to scold us when we misbehaved. Since childhood, I felt something different inside me. I wasn't like my brothers, who dreamed of playing soccer or working in the big city. I liked to stay in church after Mass, watching Father Joachim, a simple man with calloused hands and a kind gaze, pray alone before the Blessed Sacrament. He would see me there, sitting in the last pew, and would always come talk to me. "Ricardo, my son," he would say with that calm smile, "God has special plans for those who know how to listen in silence." At 12 years old, during a night of novena to the Divine Holy Spirit, a traditional festival that gathered the entire community at the festival host's house, with litanies, fireworks, and abundant food, I felt for the first time what I believed to be a divine calling. I was kneeling before the improvised altar in Donna Maria's living room, the festival host that year, when a strange sensation took over my chest. It was as if someone had lit a candle inside me. In that moment, I was certain God wanted me to be a priest. I told my mother the next day. She cried with joy, squeezed my face with both hands and said, "My son is going to be a priest. Thank God." My father, on the other hand, remained silent for a long time. Then he placed his hand on my shoulder and said only, "If that's what God wants, then go with him, boy." I entered the seminary at 15. It was 12 years of intense formation. 3 years of philosophy, 4 years of theology, and many moments of doubt, loneliness, and renunciation. The seminary wasn't easy. We woke up at 5 in the morning to pray Lauds, participated in the Eucharist before breakfast, had classes all day long, and at night we prayed Vespers before sleeping. It was a routine of total surrender, but I loved it. I loved the liturgy. I loved studying the scriptures. I loved the idea of serving God's people. During formation, I learned about the 4 proximities that every priest should cultivate. Proximity to Jesus, to the bishop, to other priests, and to God's people. I took those words seriously. I truly believed I was being molded for something sacred. I was ordained a priest at 27 in a moving ceremony at the Cathedral of Santa Clara. My mother cried the entire time. My father, always serious, let slip a few tears when the bishop placed his hands on my head and consecrated me a priest forever. That day, I felt my life had found its ultimate purpose. The first years as a priest were the happiest of my life. I was assigned to the parish of São Sebastião in my own hometown. Every day, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, prayed alone in the sacristy at 5 o'clock, celebrated the 6:30 Mass, exposed the Blessed Sacrament, and then attended to people who needed me. My routine was intense, but full of meaning. I baptized children, married young lovers, visited the sick, heard confessions on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and if someone needed it on any other day, I would attend to them. I didn't take days off from Mass because I believed that the priest was ordained for this, to celebrate every day, even if alone. My life revolved around the altar and the people. Santa Clara do Vale was a small city but with big problems. Poverty was visible on every corner. Entire families lived without basic sanitation. Children abandoned school to work in the fields, and local politicians seemed more interested in filling their own pockets than in serving the people. I saw all of this up close, and it bothered me deeply. I began using my homilies to talk about social justice. I quoted the prophets of the Old Testament who denounced the oppression of the poor. I spoke about Jesus who expelled the money changers from the temple and said it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. My masses began to fill up. People came from distant neighborhoods just to hear me. I became known in the region as the priest of the poor. I organized collective efforts to build affordable housing, created a food drive campaign that fed more than 200 families per week, and even managed to pressure City Hall to install running water in 2 forgotten neighborhoods. I felt useful. I felt alive. It was during this time that I met Marcelo Vieira, a city councilman from the opposition party. He showed up at the parish on a Thursday afternoon after Mass and asked to speak with me. Marcelo was young, charismatic, with an inflammatory speech about social transformation and justice for the most vulnerable. He said he had followed my work and saw in me a true leader of the people. "Father Ricardo," he said, looking into my eyes with an intensity I had never seen before, "you have done more for this city than any politician in the last 20 years. But you know that alone you won't be able to change the system. For that, you need to be inside it." I didn't immediately understand what he meant, but Marcelo continued, "Have you thought about running for office? You have the people's trust. You have credibility. With you in Congress, we could make real laws, laws that protect the poor, laws that change lives." I laughed. I found it absurd. "Marcelo, I'm a priest. My place is at the altar, not in politics." But he didn't give up. He came back other times, always with the same speech, always planting that seed of doubt in my head, and little by little that seed began to germinate. I spent weeks thinking about that conversation. I couldn't get Marcelo's words out of my head. "You have the power to change lives, but alone you won't be able to change the system." I knew he was partly right. No matter how many fundraising campaigns, collective efforts and social actions I organized, the city's structural problems remained there, untouched. Political corruption, neglect of the poorest, lack of basic infrastructure, all of this was bigger than any parish could solve. But there was something that bothered me even more, the idea of abandoning the altar. Since childhood, I had been taught that priesthood was an eternal calling, a total surrender to God. "Once a priest, forever a priest," Father Joachim used to say, and I believed that with all my strength. Being a priest wasn't just a profession, it was an identity. It was who I was. I began to question, for the first time in my life, whether God really wanted me to stay bound to the altar while the world around me crumbled. Did serving God mean only celebrating masses and administering sacraments, or could serving God also mean fighting for justice within the political system, where decisions actually happened? I prayed a lot during that time. I spent hours before the Blessed Sacrament, asking for clarity, asking for a sign, but the answer I sought never came clearly. What came was a growing restlessness, a feeling that I was wasting my potential by staying limited to the parish walls. It was during this period of doubt that Marcelo returned. This time he didn't come alone. He brought with him 3 community leaders, people I knew well, who attended my masses and who had benefited from the parish's social actions. They sat in my room and one by one told me how much I had changed their lives. But they also told me they needed more. They needed someone who truly represented them, someone who would take their voices to where laws were made. "Father Ricardo," said Donna Aparecida, a 60-year-old woman I had helped obtain a house through a housing program, "you're the only one we trust. If you don't go into politics, who will defend us? The same old politicians only steal and lie. But you're different. You have faith. You have character." Those words shook me deeply. I saw tears in that woman's eyes. I saw hope, and I saw desperation. How could I say no to people who had placed all their trust in me? That night, I slept little. I kept thinking about what Jesus would do in my place. Jesus didn't stay inside the temple. He went out, confronted the Pharisees, denounced the powerful, defended the poor and marginalized. Jesus was political, in the purest sense of the word. He fought for social justice, for transformation, for a more humane society. Shouldn't I do the same? That's how slowly the idea of entering politics stopped being absurd and started making sense to me. I began to rationalize, to build arguments that justified that decision. I can be both priest and politician, I thought. I can use my influence for good. I can be the voice of the voiceless. Of course, I knew the church prohibited priests from holding political office. The Code of Canon Law was clear on this point. Clerics could not assume public functions that implied exercise of civil power. But I also knew that, throughout history, several priests had become involved in politics, especially in Latin America. Father Cicero in Ceará had been mayor. Father Josimo Tavares had fought for the rights of rural workers and ended up assassinated by landowners. If they had had the courage to challenge the system, why couldn't I do the same? I convinced myself that the church's prohibition was a bureaucratic matter, an old rule that made no sense in the modern world. I convinced myself that God would understand my choice. After all, I wasn't abandoning my faith, I was just changing the way I served. That's when I made the decision. I looked for Marcelo and told him I was willing to run for federal deputy. The smile he opened was immense. "Father Ricardo, you won't regret it. Together, we're going to change this country." But before publicly announcing my candidacy, I needed to speak with the bishop. Dom Fernando, Bishop of the Diocese of Santa Clara, was a serious, conservative but fair man. I knew he wouldn't be happy with my decision, but I hoped he would understand. I scheduled a meeting with him on a Tuesday afternoon. When I entered his office, Dom Fernando received me with a cordial smile, but I noticed a certain coldness in his gaze. "Ricardo, my son, what brings you here?" I took a deep breath and said, "Dom Fernando, I come to inform you of a decision I've made. I'm going to run for federal deputy." The silence that followed was heavy. Dom Fernando stared at me for long seconds, as if trying to understand whether I was serious. Finally, he sighed deeply and said, "Ricardo, you know this is prohibited by canon law." "I know, Dom Fernando," I replied, "but I believe this is God's will. I have an opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of thousands of people. I can't waste this." Dom Fernando shook his head, visibly disappointed. "Ricardo, you're confusing things. Your mission is to be a priest. Your mission is to celebrate the sacraments, guide souls, be a spiritual shepherd. Politics is not the path for a priest." "But Dom Fernando," I insisted, "Jesus was also political. He challenged the powerful, defended the poor. He didn't stay confined to the temple." "Jesus didn't run for office, Ricardo," Dom Fernando responded, his voice firm. "Jesus didn't seek temporal power, and you know that." I felt anger rising inside me, anger at being misunderstood, anger at being limited by rules that to me no longer made sense. "Dom Fernando, with all due respect, I've already made my decision." He looked at me with sadness. "Then you leave me no choice, Ricardo. If you proceed with this candidacy, I will be obliged to inform Rome, and you know what that means." I knew. It meant the Vatican would be notified. It meant I would be called to choose, either give up politics or be suspended from the exercise of priesthood. But at that moment I didn't care. I was convinced I was doing the right thing. "Do what you need to do, Dom Fernando," I said, rising from the chair, "but I will also do what I need to do." I left that office with my heart racing, but also with a strange sensation of freedom. For the first time in my life, I was making a decision that wasn't dictated by the church, but by myself. I was becoming master of my own destiny, or at least that's what I thought. In the following weeks, everything happened very quickly. Marcelo organized my party affiliation, began preparing my campaign, and soon I was giving interviews, participating in political meetings, and recording promotional videos. My popularity as the priest of the poor transformed into valuable political capital. The polls showed I had great chances of being elected. But at the same time, something inside me began to fade. I spent less and less time in church. My prayers became shorter, more mechanical. I still celebrated masses, but my heart was no longer there. It was on the platforms, in the speeches, in the applause of the crowd. And that's how, without realizing it, I began to lose my soul. The news of my candidacy spread like wildfire through dry straw. In less than a week, I was in all the local newspapers, on community radio stations, and even on some regional television networks. Father Ricardo Mendes, the man of God who wants to change politics, read one headline. The priest of the poor is going to Brasilia, announced another. The community's reaction was divided. On one side, there were those who supported me unconditionally. They were the families I had helped, the residents of neighborhoods forgotten by public authorities, the rural workers who found a voice in me. For them, I was a hero, a man who had the courage to leave the comfort of the parish to face the corrupt system head-on. On the other side, there were the more traditional Catholics, those who had attended Mass every Sunday for decades, and who saw my decision as a betrayal. Donna Margarida, a 70-year-old woman who always sat in the first pew of the church, approached me one day after Mass with tears in her eyes. "Father Ricardo, how can you do this to us? You were our shepherd. Now you've become a politician. Politicians are no good, Father. You know that." Those words hurt me, but I was already convinced I was doing the right thing. I told her, with all the calmness I could muster, "Donna Margarida, I'm still a priest, and I'm still fighting for the people. The only difference is that now I'll do it from a place where I can actually change the laws that oppress the weakest." She shook her head, disappointed, and walked away without saying anything else. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I pushed that feeling to the back of my mind. I couldn't let doubts paralyze me now. Meanwhile, the electoral campaign advanced at full steam. Marcelo assembled a political marketing team that transformed my image into a sellable product. They made emotional videos, with images of me distributing food in needy communities, hugging children, visiting the sick. The soundtrack was always gospel music or a Catholic choir in the background. Everything planned to touch people's hearts. I participated in rallies, climbed onto improvised platforms in the city squares, and spoke to increasingly larger crowds. My speech was always the same: social justice, dignity for the poor, fight against corruption. And the people applauded. The people shouted my name. The people believed in me. But the more I climbed onto platforms, the more I distanced myself from the altar. The masses I celebrated became increasingly mechanical. I read the gospel, but my mind was on the electoral polls. I consecrated the bread and wine, but my heart was in the speeches I would prepare for the next rally. I was physically present in church, but spiritually absent. And then, on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the start of my campaign, I received a letter. The envelope had the Vatican coat of arms printed in the upper left corner. My heart raced when I saw that symbol. I knew what was inside that letter before I even opened it. I sat down in the sacristy, alone, and tore open the envelope with trembling hands. The letter was written in Portuguese, but with formal and distant language. It was an official notification from the Congregation for the Clergy, the Vatican body responsible for matters related to priests. The text was direct and relentless. The Holy See had been informed that I, Father Ricardo Mendes, had joined a political party and launched my candidacy for federal deputy in clear violation of Canon 285 of the Code of Canon Law, which prohibits clerics from assuming public offices that imply participation in civil power. The letter demanded that I make an immediate decision, either renounce the candidacy and return to the exclusive exercise of priestly ministry, or be suspended a divinis, losing the right to celebrate sacraments and exercise any clerical function. I had 30 days to respond. I read that letter 3 times. With each reading, I felt a mixture of anger, fear, and indignation growing inside me. Anger, because I thought it was unfair. Fear because, for the first time, the reality of the consequences was right before my eyes. And indignation because I convinced myself that the church was wrong, that those rules were outdated and made no sense in the modern world. I put the letter in a drawer and didn't tell anyone. Not Marcello, not the community leaders who supported me, not my family. I needed to think alone. That night, I went to the church when it was already empty. I knelt before the Blessed Sacrament, as I had done since childhood, and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come out. My mind was confused, divided between 2 worlds that seemed incompatible. On one side was the altar, the place where I had dedicated 17 years of my life, the place where I had baptized children, heard confessions, comforted mourners, celebrated weddings, the place that represented my deepest identity. I was a priest. On the other side was the platform, the place where I felt I could make a real difference, change lives on a larger scale, transform the system from within. The place that represented my ambition, my desire to be more than just a small-town parish priest. I stayed there, kneeling for more than 2 hours. And when I left the church that night, I already knew what my choice would be. In the following days, I began preparing my response to the Vatican. I talked to Marcello and told him about the letter. He didn't seem surprised. "Father Ricardo, this was expected. The church wasn't going to let it pass, but now you need to decide. Do you want to stay bound to old rules, or do you want to really make a difference?" Those words echoed in my mind like a hammer hitting an anvil. Old rules. That's how I had begun to see the church's teachings, as obstacles, not as guidance. I also sought out some priest friends, people I trusted, to ask for advice. Most of them begged me to give up politics. "Ricardo, you're going to lose everything," said Father Antonio, a seminary colleague who became my best friend. "You're going to lose your identity. You're going to lose your soul." But I didn't want to listen. I had already convinced myself that everyone was wrong, and that only I saw the truth. I was blinded by arrogance, by the illusion that my mission was greater than the vocation I had received. On the 28th day after receiving the notification, I sent my response to the Vatican. It was a 2-page letter, written in a respectful but firm tone. I thanked the Holy See for their concern, but informed them that after much prayer and reflection, I had decided to proceed with my political candidacy. I argued that I saw in that choice a different way of serving God and the people, and that I hoped the Church would understand my decision. I knew that letter would be the point of no return, and I was right. 2 weeks later, I received the response. It was an official decree, signed by the Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy. The text was short and devastating. Father Ricardo Mendes was officially suspended a divinis. I was prohibited from celebrating masses, hearing confessions, administering any sacraments, or exercising any clerical function. The suspension would be definitive if I did not renounce my political candidacy within 15 days. When I finished reading that decree, I felt as if the ground had opened up beneath my feet. For the first time since I made the decision to enter politics, I felt real fear. Fear of losing who I was, fear of making the biggest mistake of my life. But it was too late to turn back, or at least that's what I told myself. The news of my suspension spread like a wildfire. In less than 24 hours, all of Santa Clara do Vale knew I had been officially removed from priesthood. Local newspapers displayed sensationalist headlines. Father Ricardo chooses politics and is expelled by the Church. Vatican punishes priest who became politician. The division in the community, which had already existed since the announcement of my candidacy, now transformed into a deep fracture. On one side, my supporters said I was a victim of an antiquated and authoritarian church. On the other, traditional Catholics saw me as a traitor, someone who had abandoned God to seek personal glory. My mother, Donna Teresa, was devastated. I remember the day I went to visit her, a week after receiving the suspension decree. She was sitting in the living room, with eyes red from crying so much, holding a rosary in her hands. When she saw me, she didn't get up to hug me as she always did. She just looked at me with an expression that mixed pain, disappointment, and love. "Ricardo," she said, her voice trembling, "what have you done with your life? You were a priest, my son. God called you for this, and you threw it all away because of politics." I tried to explain. I tried to say I was doing this to help people, to change the system, to make a real difference, but she shook her head, inconsolable. "You're deceiving yourself, Ricardo. Politics doesn't save anyone. Only God saves, and you turned your back on him." Those words pierced me like a spear. But I was so hardened, so convinced I was right, that I just stood up and left that house without saying anything more. It was the last conversation I had with my mother, while she was still lucid. My father, on the other hand, didn't say a word. He just looked at me with that heavy gaze, the same gaze he had when I was a child, and did something very wrong. That silence hurt more than any words could hurt. At the parish, the situation became unsustainable. Dom Fernando officially informed me that I could no longer celebrate masses or exercise any pastoral activity. A new priest was designated to take my place at the parish of San Sebastian. I would need to leave the rectory in 30 days. When I received this news, I felt as if I were being expelled from home. That parish had been my home for almost 10 years. Every corner of that place had a memory. The confessional, where I had heard hundreds of confessions, the altar, where I had celebrated thousands of masses, the sacristy, where I prayed alone every morning. And now I would have to leave everything behind. Marcelo helped me find a small apartment in the city center. He said it was temporary, that once I was elected I would have a comfortable life in Brasilia. But at that moment, while I packed my few clothes and some theology books I insisted on carrying with me, I felt more alone than I had ever been in my life. The electoral campaign continued, but something had changed in me. I still climbed onto platforms, still gave inflammatory speeches, still shook hands and posed for photos with voters. But inside, I felt a growing emptiness, a sensation that I had lost something essential and irreversible. I still dressed in black, still wore the clerical shirt during rallies. Marcelo advised me to continue wearing that attire because it connected me with my identity as the priest of the poor. But every time I looked in the mirror and saw those clothes, I felt a pang of guilt. I was no longer a priest. The church had suspended me. I no longer had the right to wear those vestments. But I ignored that inner voice screaming at me to stop. I had already gone too far to give up now. The rallies became increasingly larger and more emotional. I spoke about social injustice, about the poor who were forgotten by the state, about the need for ethical politics committed to the people. People applauded, shouted my name, raised posters with my photo. I felt important, I felt powerful, but at night, when I returned to that small and silent apartment, I would kneel beside the bed and try to pray. I tried to find God in that chaos my life had become, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if there were a wall between me and heaven. I knew the reason for that silence. I had chosen the world instead of God, and now I was reaping the consequences of that choice. 1 week before the elections, I received an unexpected visit. It was Father Antonio, my best friend since seminary. He knocked on my apartment door on a Thursday afternoon, and when I opened it, I saw tears in his eyes. "Ricardo," he said, hugging me tightly, "I came here because I love you, brother. And because I can't stay quiet, watching you destroy yourself." We sat in the small living room of the apartment, and Father Antonio spoke for almost an hour. He reminded me of everything we had lived through together in seminary, of the dreams we had of serving God and the people, of the promises we made on the day of our ordination. He told me I still had time to turn back, to ask forgiveness from the church, to renounce the candidacy and return to the altar. "Ricardo, you're still a priest in essence," he said, holding my hands. "Priestly ordination is eternal. You may be suspended, but you continue being a priest. And God still loves you. He still waits for you." I listened to everything in silence, and for a brief moment I felt like saying yes, giving up everything, going back home. But then I thought about the electoral polls, which placed me in second place with great chances of being elected. I thought about the thousands of people who believed in me, who placed their hopes in my candidacy. I thought about everything I had sacrificed to get there, and I said no. "Antonio, I thank you for coming here, but I've already made my decision. I'm going all the way. I'm going to be elected, and I'm going to prove to everyone that I was right." Father Antonio looked at me with deep sadness. He stood up, placed his hand on my shoulder, and said, "Then I will pray for you, Ricardo, because you're going to need many prayers." And he left, leaving me alone again. The following Sunday was the last Sunday before the elections. I was scheduled to hold a large rally in the main square of Santa Clara do Vale. More than 3,000 people were waiting to hear me. I climbed onto the platform, grabbed the microphone, and began to speak. But in the middle of the speech, something happened. My eyes found, in the middle of the crowd, the face of Donna Margarida, the 70-year-old woman who had confronted me months ago at the exit of Mass. She was there, standing with arms crossed, looking at me with an expression of disappointment and sadness. In that instant, something inside me broke. For the first time since I made the decision to enter politics, I felt shame. Shame for being there, dressed in black, pretending to be something I was no longer. Shame for having traded the altar for the platform. Shame for having chosen power instead of God. I finished the speech on autopilot, without really knowing what I was saying. I descended from the platform, ignored the congratulations from supporters, and ran back to the apartment. And there, alone, I cried for the first time in months. I cried for the loss of my identity. I cried for my mother, who was sick with grief. I cried for the priest I used to be, and who might never return. But it was too late to turn back. The election was scheduled for 3 days from now, and I had already made my choice, an irreversible choice. Election day arrived. It was a sunny Sunday, typical of October, and Santa Clara do Vale was in turmoil. The streets were full of voters walking toward the polling stations, campaign workers distributing flyers at school entrances, and an atmosphere of expectation hanging in the air. I woke up at 5 in the morning, as I always did when I was still a priest, but this time it wasn't to pray. It was to prepare for the most important day of my new life. I put on my black shirt, the one that still resembled the cassock, but no longer had the same meaning, and went out to vote at the municipal school where I had studied as a child. When I arrived at the polling station, there was a small crowd waiting for me. Supporters held posters with my photo, shouted my name, applauded. Some hugged me with tears in their eyes, saying I was their hope, that I represented a new era in Brazilian politics. I smiled, waved, shook hands. But inside I felt a strange emptiness. After voting, I went to the campaign headquarters, where Marcelo and the entire team were gathered. They set up an operations center with computers on, televisions broadcasting the news, and people monitoring social media. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that day would define not only my future, but the future of hundreds of people who had invested time, money, and hope in my candidacy. At 5 p.m., the ballot boxes were officially closed throughout the country. From that moment on, votes began to be tallied by the Superior Electoral Court's supercomputers. The counting was fast, efficient, almost magical. In a few hours, we would know the final result. I stayed there at headquarters, surrounded by people but feeling completely alone. As the numbers began to appear on computer screens, I thought about my mother, who had refused to vote that day. I thought about my father, who also didn't show up. I thought about Father Antonio, who was probably praying for me, asking God for me to come to my senses. I thought about Dom Fernando, who was certainly following the results with sadness, but I couldn't allow myself to think about these things now. I needed to focus. I needed to win. At 6:30 p.m., the first partial results began to be released. My name appeared on the list of candidates for federal deputy for the state. I was in third place, with 8% of votes counted. Marcelo shouted with joy, "Ricardo, you're doing well. If you continue like this, you'll be elected." The team celebrated. Some opened bottles of soda as if it were champagne. Others hugged me, patted my back, said I was a winner. But I just watched those numbers on the screen, feeling a strange mixture of euphoria and anguish. At 7 p.m., with 25% of votes counted, I had risen to second position. The screams at headquarters became even louder. People began calling me Congressman Ricardo. I smiled, but my smile was forced. At 8 p.m., with 50% of votes counted, I was consolidated in second position, with great chances of being elected. Marcelo hugged me tightly and said, "You did it, Ricardo. You're going to Brasilia." And then at 9:45 p.m., with 98% of votes counted, the result was practically confirmed. I had been elected federal deputy with more than 120,000 votes. It was the second highest vote count in the state. It was an overwhelming victory. The headquarters exploded in celebration. People screamed, cried, lifted me in their arms as if I were a hero. Journalists called, asking for interviews. Supporters began arriving at headquarters, wanting to take photos with me, wanting to hug me, wanting to be part of that historic moment. But I, in the middle of that euphoric crowd, felt an immense emptiness inside my chest. It was as if I had conquered the entire world, but lost my soul in the process. Marcelo organized an impromptu party right there at headquarters. Loud music, food, drinks, and many people celebrating my victory. I was forced to climb on a chair and make a speech. I grabbed the microphone, looked at all those people and said, "We won. We proved it's possible to do politics differently. We showed that the people can trust someone who really cares about the poorest." People applauded, shouted my name, cried with emotion, but while I spoke those words, I felt I was lying, because I hadn't entered politics just to help the poor. I had entered politics because I wanted to prove something to myself, because I wanted to be more than just a small-town priest, because I wanted power, recognition, glory. And now I had all of that. But at what cost? The party continued until late at night, but I left around 11 p.m., saying I was tired and needed to rest. I returned to my small apartment alone. When I entered that empty and silent space, I finally allowed the emotions I had repressed all day to come to the surface. I sat on the bed, put my head in my hands and began to cry. I had won, but at the same time, I had lost everything. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened in recent months. I thought about the day I decided to enter politics. I thought about the day I received the Vatican notification. I thought about the day I was suspended ad divinis. I thought about the pain in my mother's eyes when she told me I had turned my back on God. And for the first time, I began to question whether I had made the right choice. But it was too late to turn back. I had been elected. I had a mandate ahead of me. I had responsibilities, commitments, expectations. There was no more room for regret, or at least that's what I tried to convince myself. The next morning, Monday, my phone didn't stop ringing. Journalists wanting interviews, politicians wanting to get close to me, voters wanting to take photos. I had become an important public figure. I was now Congressman Ricardo Mendez, the priest who defied the church to serve the people. But when I looked in the mirror, I no longer recognized the man staring back at me. That wasn't the Ricardo who had entered seminary at 15, full of dreams of serving God. That wasn't the Ricardo who had been ordained a priest at 27, with tears of joy in his eyes. That was a stranger, an imposter dressed in black, pretending to be something he was no longer. And worst of all, I no longer knew who I really was. 2 weeks after the election, I received another letter from the Vatican. This time, it was no longer a notification. It was a final decree. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, already knowing what was written there, and I confirmed. Father Ricardo Mendez was officially dismissed from the clerical state. I wasn't just suspended. I had been definitively expelled from the Catholic Church. The letter said that by choosing to continue in politics after all the warnings, I had unequivocally demonstrated that I no longer wished to live according to the obligations of priesthood. Therefore, the Holy See had decided on my dismissal from the clerical state, a rare and extreme measure reserved only for cases of total abandonment of priestly vocation. I was no longer a priest, officially, definitively, irreversibly. I read that letter 3 times, and then, for the first time since I made the decision to enter politics, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of that choice. I had traded the altar for the platform. I had traded God for power, and now I was reaping the consequences of that choice. I sat on the apartment sofa, holding that letter in my hands, and let the tears fall freely. I cried for the loss of my identity. I cried for the pain I caused my family. I cried for the priest I used to be, and who would never be again. And for the first time I asked myself, was it worth it? In February of the following year, I moved to Brasilia, the federal capital. With its monumental buildings, wide avenues and dry climate, was a completely different world from Santa Clara do Vale. Here, everything was impersonal, bureaucratic, distant. People didn't greet each other on the streets. Nobody knew you by name. You were just another parliamentarian among 513 deputies and 81 senators. Marcelo helped me set up my office. We hired advisors, organized the administrative structure, defined the committees I would participate in. I was assigned to the Social Security and Family Committee, and also to the Human Rights and Minorities Committee. These were areas that theoretically had everything to do with my history of social work. The first days in Congress were surreal. I walked through the corridors of the Planalto Palace, watching those men and women in suits, carrying briefcases, talking in groups, making deals in the corners of rooms. Everything there seemed like theater, a grand game of appearances. The routine of a federal deputy was intense, but empty. In the morning, we participated in thematic committee meetings, where bills were discussed. Or rather, where deputies pretended to discuss bills, because in reality, almost nobody read what they were voting on. In the afternoon, there were plenary sessions, where we voted on dozens of matters in a matter of minutes. Most deputies didn't even know what they were voting on. They just followed the party leader's guidance, pressing the green or red button as instructed. I tried, at first, to be different. I read the bills, studied the proposals, tried to understand the implications of each vote. But I soon realized that was useless. The system didn't work based on ideas or principles. It worked based on political agreements, exchanges of favors, bargaining. Ricardo, Marcelo told me one day while we had coffee in one of Congress's restaurants, you need to understand how things work here. If you want to pass any bill, you need to make alliances. You need to negotiate. You need to support other deputies' bills to receive support for yours. That's how politics works. I knew he was right, but it disgusted me, because negotiating often meant supporting bills I didn't believe in. It meant voting in favor of measures that benefited large companies at the expense of the poorest. It meant turning a blind eye to corruption scandals involving fellow parliamentarians. I had entered politics believing I would change the system. But what happened was that the system changed me. Disillusionment came quickly. In the first 6 months of my term, I presented 3 bills related to protecting low-income families, access to quality education, and fighting hunger. None of them were even brought to a vote. They were archived in committees, shelved by deputies who had other interests. Meanwhile, I saw absurd bills being approved with impressive speed. Bills that benefited large corporations, that reduced taxes for the rich, that dismantled public policies protecting the most vulnerable, and deputies voted in favor without blinking because they had received some compensation in return. I felt disgusted, but I also felt powerless. What could I do alone? I was just one vote among 513, and then something inside me began to break definitively. I started missing committee meetings. I stopped reading bills. I began voting following only the party leader's guidance, as everyone else did. I became exactly what I had sworn to fight, a complacent politician who just occupied a seat and received a hefty salary without making any real difference in anyone's life. But worst of all was the existential emptiness I felt. I lived alone in a functional apartment in Brasilia. I had no true friends. I had no family nearby. My mother had died a few months after my election. She died without forgiving me for the choice I made. My father refused to speak to me. Father Antonio had given up contacting me after I stopped responding to his messages. I was completely alone, and that loneliness was suffocating. At night, when I returned to the empty apartment, I would sit on the sofa and stare at the white walls, feeling an enormous weight in my chest. It was an anguishing sensation that my life no longer had meaning. I traded everything, my vocation, my identity, my family, my faith, for what? For a political position that brought me no satisfaction whatsoever. I started drinking. First, just a glass of whiskey at night to relax. Then 2 glasses. Then half a bottle. Alcohol temporarily anesthetized that existential pain, that emptiness consuming me from within. But when the effect wore off, the emptiness returned even larger. I tried to fill that emptiness with other things. I bought expensive clothes, frequented sophisticated restaurants, traveled to luxurious places during parliamentary recesses. But none of this brought me true happiness. It was all superficial, fleeting, illusory. I missed the altar. I missed celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, being close to people who really needed me. I missed praying and feeling that God was there, present, listening to me. But now when I tried to pray, I only found silence, a deafening and condemning silence. 1 year after taking office as deputy, I received devastating news. Marcelo, my advisor and friend, was arrested by the federal police in an operation against corruption. He was involved in a scheme to embezzle public funds along with other parliamentarians. When the news was released, my name also appeared in the investigations. I wasn't directly involved in the scheme, but the fact that Marcelo was my closest advisor put me under suspicion. The press began investigating me, questioning my conduct, digging into my past. And it was there, in that moment of humiliating public exposure, that I finally saw the complete truth of what I had become. I was no longer the priest of the poor. I was no longer a man of faith. I was no longer a respected community leader. I was just another politician involved in scandals, surrounded by corrupt people, lost in a rotten system that I had naively believed I could change. I sat alone in my office that grey afternoon in July and cried as I hadn't cried since childhood. I cried for the irreparable loss of my identity. I cried for my mother's death, who went to her grave carrying the pain of having a son who abandoned God. I cried for the priest I used to be and who would never be again. I looked at the federal deputy diploma hanging on the office wall. That piece of paper had cost everything I had that was most precious. And now, looking at it, I realized it was worth nothing. I picked up my cell phone and called Father Antonio. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice surprised. "Ricardo, is that you?" I couldn't speak. I just sobbed on the other end of the line. He waited in silence until I managed to say, my voice choked, "Antonio, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I lost everything. I don't know who I am anymore." There was a long pause. Then he said, his voice full of compassion, "Ricardo, God still loves you. No matter what you've done, no matter how far you've strayed, He's still waiting for you." Those words broke me completely, because I knew they were true, but I also knew that the road back would be long, painful, and perhaps impossible. I hung up the phone and stayed there, sitting in the empty office, surrounded by the power I had so desired, but which I now realized was absolutely empty. I had traded the altar for the platform. I had traded God for power, and now I was reaping the bitter fruits of that choice, a choice that destroyed my life, a choice I would carry forever. The scandal involving Marcello grew like a snowball. Each day, new details were revealed by the press: embezzlement of parliamentary amendments, overpricing of public works, fraudulent contracts with shell companies. It was a complex scheme involving dozens of politicians, businessmen, and public officials. And my name was in the middle of all that. Not because I had directly participated in the scheme, I really didn't know what Marcello was doing behind my back, but because I was too naive, too trusting, too blind to realize I was being used. The federal police summoned me to testify. I spent 6 hours answering questions from federal agents who looked at me with suspicion. They wanted to know about my relationship with Marcello, about the decisions I made in my office, about the parliamentary amendments I directed to projects in Santa Clara do Vale. I answered everything honestly. I had nothing to hide, because I really hadn't stolen a penny of public money, but the press didn't care about that. To the newspapers, I was just another corrupt politician involved in a scandal. The headlines were devastating. Former priest involved in corruption scheme. Congressman Ricardo Mendez under federal police investigation. The priest who traded the altar for crime. My public image was destroyed in a matter of days. The same people who had applauded me at rallies now cursed me on social media. The voters who had placed their trust in me felt betrayed, and I couldn't blame them, because in a way, I had truly betrayed them. Don Fernando gave an interview to a Catholic newspaper, saying he had warned about the dangers of politics, but that I didn't want to listen. Father Ricardo chose the world instead of God, and now he's reaping the consequences of that choice, he said. Those words pierced me like a sword, because they were true. The pressure kept mounting. The Chamber of Deputies opened an investigation process against me. The Ethics Council summoned me to testify. There was a real possibility that my mandate would be revoked, as had happened with several deputies in the Mensalon scandal years earlier. I spent sleepless nights lying in bed in the empty apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how my life had crumbled so quickly. In less than 2 years, I had lost everything: my vocation, my family, my dignity, my reputation. And for what? To have a political position I hated, to be involved in scandals I never wanted to be part of, to live a life of loneliness, emptiness, and bitterness. That's when I made the most important decision in recent years. I was going to resign my mandate. Some politicians resigned to avoid revocation, which would leave them ineligible for 8 years. But that wasn't what motivated me. I no longer wanted to be a politician. I no longer wanted to be in that toxic, corrupt, and inhumane environment. I wanted to go home. I wanted to return to who I really was. I called a press conference in my office. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, microphones. I sat at the table, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I come here today to announce my resignation from my federal deputy mandate, I said, my voice firm but emotional. I entered politics believing I could make a difference, but I got lost along the way. I made the biggest mistake of my life by abandoning my priestly vocation to seek political power. I paused. Some journalists were writing frantically in their notebooks. Television cameras were focused on my face. I want to ask for forgiveness, I continued, feeling tears beginning to well up in my eyes. Forgiveness from the people of Santa Clara do Vale, who believed in me. Forgiveness from my voters who placed their trust in an imperfect man. Forgiveness from the Catholic Church, which tried to guide me, but which I rejected with arrogance. And forgiveness from God, who called me to be a priest, but whom I abandoned in search of personal glory. I couldn't continue. I lowered my head and let the tears fall freely. All the pain, all the guilt, all the regret I had repressed for months finally exploded in that moment. I am not a victim, I said, raising my face again. I made wrong choices, and now I'm accepting the consequences of those choices. I resign my mandate not to flee from justice because I didn't commit any crime and will prove my innocence, but because I no longer want to be part of this system. I want to return to being who I really am, or at least try. I ended the press conference without answering questions. I left that room for the last time as a federal deputy. The resignation had immediate repercussions. Some newspapers praised me for the courage to admit mistakes. Others said I was just trying to escape the revocation process, but I no longer cared what people thought. I packed my few things in the Brasilia apartment and returned to Santa Clara do Vale. I no longer had my own house there. The rectory had not been mine for over a year. I rented a small room in a simple boarding house in the city centre. When I arrived in the city, some people recognized me on the street. Some looked at me with pity, others with contempt, others with curiosity. But nobody came to talk to me. I was completely alone. I spent the first days just wandering through the city streets, observing the places that had marked my life. I passed in front of the church where I was baptized, in front of the house where I grew up, which now belonged to other people, in front of the parish of São Sebastião, where I was a priest for so many years. I entered the church on a Thursday afternoon. It was empty, silent, illuminated only by the dim light of votive candles. I sat in the last pew, the same one where I used to sit when I was a child. I looked at the altar. The new priest was there, organizing the vestments for the evening mass. He was young, full of energy, committed to his vocation, exactly as I once was. I felt a deep pain in my chest. That should be my place. That altar should be the center of my life, but I had thrown everything away. I knelt down, and for the first time in over a year, tried to pray for real. Not the mechanical prayers I prayed when I still pretended to be a priest, but a sincere, broken, desperate prayer. God, I whispered, my voice choked. I don't know if I still have the right to speak to you. I abandoned you. I chose the world instead of you. I destroyed everything you gave me, but I ask you, please forgive me. I repent. I repent of everything. Tears ran freely down my face. And then, in that profound silence of the empty church, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt God's presence. It wasn't something audible or visible. It was just a gentle, warm sensation that I wasn't completely lost, that there was still hope, that God, despite everything, still loved me. I stayed there, kneeling, crying, for almost 2 hours. When I finally stood up, I felt that something inside me had begun to heal. I knew the road back would be long. I knew that perhaps I could never officially be a priest again. I knew I would have to carry the consequences of my choices for the rest of my life. But for the first time in a long time, I had hope. Hope for redemption. The following months were the most difficult of my life. I needed to start from scratch in a city where everyone knew me and where my story of downfall was public and humiliating. I had no job, no money, no family to support me. But I had something I hadn't had in a long time: humility and willingness to learn from my mistakes. I began working small jobs to support myself. I helped in a carpentry shop in the morning, delivered lunchboxes in the afternoon, and at night cleaned the hall of an evangelical church that welcomed me without judging my past. It was humble work, tiring but honest, and for the first time in years I felt peace. I also began doing volunteer work in the community. I visited the sick in hospitals, distributed food to homeless people, helped organize clothing drives in winter. I didn't do this to be recognized or to clean up my public image. I did it because I felt it was my way of paying my debt to the world, of giving back a little of what I had received and wasted. Volunteer work brought me something the political position never gave me: true purpose. When I looked into the eyes of an elderly woman receiving a hot meal, or when I hugged a child receiving a new coat, I felt I was making a real difference. They weren't laws, they weren't speeches, they weren't numbers, they were lives, real people, with names, stories, pains, and it was there, in the anonymity of service to others, that I began to find myself again. Father Antonio sought me out a few months after my return to Santa Clara de Vail. He invited me for coffee, and we talked for hours. I told him about my journey of repentance, about my attempt to start over, about my desire to someday return to serving God fully. He listened to everything with patience and compassion, and then he told me something that changed my perspective. Ricardo, you never stopped being a priest in your heart. Priestly ordination is eternal. You were dismissed from the clerical state, but that doesn't erase what God did in you on the day of your ordination. You can still serve God. Perhaps not the way you did before, but in new ways He will show you. Those words were like balm for my wounded soul. I began to understand that my story hadn't ended. It had taken a painful turn, but there was still hope for redemption. Over time, I reconciled with my father. He was a man of few words, but one day when I was helping him in the fields, he placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "My son, I'm proud of you, not for what you were, but for the man you're becoming." I cried that day as I hadn't cried since childhood, because those words meant forgiveness, they meant acceptance, they meant unconditional love. Today, 5 years after resigning my political mandate, I live a simple but meaningful life. I work as coordinator of social projects at an NGO that serves needy families in Santa Clara do Valle. I don't earn much, but it's enough to live with dignity. I actively participate in the Catholic community, although I cannot celebrate sacraments or exercise clerical functions. I help with catechesis, organize spiritual retreats for young people, visit the sick bringing communion when authorized by the local priest, and I learned lessons I will carry for the rest of my life. I learned that political power doesn't save anyone, that it's more important to be close to people, serving in anonymity, than to be in the spotlight trying to change systems that resist change. I learned that our choices have irreversible consequences. I will never officially be a priest again. I will never get back the years I lost. I will never see my mother again in this life, and she died without completely forgiving me. I learned that arrogance is a dangerous spiritual disease. I thought I knew more than the church, more than my superiors, more than God, and that arrogance destroyed me. I learned that God is merciful, but that His mercy doesn't nullify the natural consequences of our actions. He forgave me. I feel this in the deepest part of my soul, but I still need to carry the marks of my wrong choices, and I learned it's never too late to start over. That even after the deepest fall, there's still possibility for redemption. Not a redemption that erases the past, but a redemption that transforms us despite the past. If I could go back in time, I would never have accepted Marcelo's proposal. I would never have traded the altar for the platform. I would never have chosen political power instead of priestly vocation. But I can't go back in time. I can only move forward, carrying the lessons I learned and trying to be a better man each day. This is my story. The story of a priest who lost everything by choosing the world instead of God. The story of a man who discovered, in the most painful way possible, that there are irreversible choices and that the price of power can be one's own soul. But it's also a story of redemption, of a man who, even after falling into the deepest abyss, found strength to get up and start over. Not in the same way, not in the same place, but as a new version, humble, broken, and above all, more human. If there's a message I would like to leave for anyone who hears my story, it's this: be careful with the choices you make when you're at the height of your arrogance. Be careful with the promises of power that make you forget who you really are. Be careful with the paths that distance you from God in the name of a supposed greater mission, because power is seductive, but it's also deceptive. And when you realize the mistake, it may be too late to turn back. I learned that lesson the hardest way possible. And today, 5 years later, I'm still trying to rebuild my life, stone by stone, day by day. But there's one thing I'm certain of. God doesn't give up on us. Even when we give up on Him, Even when we make the worst choices, even when we fall into the deepest abyss, he remains there, waiting for the moment when we finally open our eyes, recognize our mistakes, and return home. And when we return, he receives us with open arms. Not as we were before, because that's impossible, but as we are now, broken, humble, transformed by pain, and that is true redemption. My name is Ricardo Mendes. I used to be a priest. Today, I'm just a man trying to live with dignity after making the biggest mistake of his life. And every day, I thank God for the opportunity to start over, because while there's life, there's hope, and while there's hope, there's redemption. And you? If you were in Ricardo's place, would you have had the courage to give up everything for politics, or would you have chosen to remain in priesthood? Comment. Altar or platform? I want to know your honest opinion. This story makes us reflect on how far we're willing to go in the name of power, and whether it's really worth trading our essence for promises of change that may never materialize. If this story impacted you, leave your like and share with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you think about faith, choices, and consequences. Until the next story.